What's up guys, and thank you for stopping by the channel. Today's project is this Featherlite string trimmer from Weedeater, and the problem is that it won't start. Let's take a good look at it and try to figure out what's wrong with it and hopefully fix it. These little curve shaft trimmers are very easy to use. They don't weigh very much, and as long as you aren't taking down tall weeds, they do a decent job. I've used one for a couple of years around the house, and I never had a problem with it. But when I needed to cut down tall weeds, I always used a much heavier and more powerful straight shaft trimmer. However, this one isn't doing anything right now, so let's start diagnosing it. We're just taking a look around and checking things out until we see a problem, and we'll tackle each problem as they come up. Okay, so here's our first obvious problem. The smaller fuel line from the carburetor to the tank is broken. It's pretty simple to replace, so let's start here. The first thing we'll need to do is take the fuel cap off so we can get the old fuel filter out of the tank and replace the fuel line. Well, it looks like the line is broken inside the tank as well, so it means the fuel filter is loose in the tank. Let's give it a good shake and get it out of there. Okay, so it looks like we've only got a bit of old line in the tank, so it looks like we'll have to replace the fuel filter with another one. And before we get ahead of ourselves, let's see if the trimmer even starts. It would be a shame if we did all this work only to find out that the engine was blown. Let's put some fuel into the throat of the carburetor and try starting it. Make sure you squeeze the throttle trigger so the gas passes into the engine instead of getting stuck at the carburetor. And luckily for us, the trimmer ran for just a little bit, so we'll continue with the fuel lines. So here's the fuel line that I'm going to be using. It's 1/8 inch line, or 125 thousandths of an inch. And I got mine from my local hardware store. Now you don't have to buy the whole spool, but you can buy it a foot at a time. To make the fuel line go into the fuel tank a little bit easier, cut it at a sharp angle. And before you put it into the hole, remove any bit of old line that might be stuck in there. So in this shot, I was trying to feed the fuel line into the tank, but I decided to make filming just a little bit easier, so I'm going to remove the air filter base. It's up to you if you want to remove yours. So I'm going to put the bolts back onto the engine so the carburetor doesn't come off. Now some of you might be wondering why I don't take the carburetor off to service it, and the answer is only if there's a problem, which we'll find out here in just 1 minute. Now let's feed the small fuel line into the tank. Fish it out through the fuel cap opening and then cut off the angled piece that we made earlier. That way we can install the fuel filter. And once the filter is back into the fuel tank, cut the line off to the length that you want it to and reconnect it to the carburetor. It's always better to cut the line longer than shorter. Now that the fuel line is fixed, let's put some gas into the fuel tank, prime the fuel system, and try starting it. Okay, so the fuel just moved into the new fuel line and into the carburetor, but the primer bulb isn't filling it with gas and pushing it back into the tank. This is going to be our second problem. Now we'll have to inspect the carburetor for any issues. The first thing we'll do is remove the fuel lines that we just installed and the bolts holding the carburetor to the engine. Now this is the first time I've ever had a carburetor this stuck to an engine before. Now that the carburetor is off the engine, let's remove the primer bulb side and see if there are any obvious problems there. And after removing the primer bulb plate from the carburetor and inspecting the diaphragm, I can't see anything wrong. There's absolutely no debris, and the diaphragm flaps are completely flat and parallel to the rest of it. And if I press the primer bulb, you can see it spray out fuel, so everything's working just like it's supposed to. Let's move over to the metering diaphragm side and see if there's any problems there. Well, here's the diaphragm, and it's in perfect shape. It's still very supple, so I'm not even going to replace it. I am, however, going to remove it and check out the rocker arm and the needle to make sure they're not stuck. Well, there's no debris or anything here on this side either. The rocker arm moves up and down like it's supposed to, and the needle is also moving. Let's check to make sure that the needle isn't clogged though. I'm going to put some gas into the pocket where the screen is and fill it up. Next, I'll reach underneath the carburetor and depress the rocker arm, which will then empty the gas in the pocket and allow the gas to move through to the other side of the carburetor. And as you can see, it does exactly what it's supposed to. If yours doesn't do this, then you'll need to remove the rocker arm and the needle and clean the opening where the needle was and also the screen. Now I'm really confused. Everything is the way it's supposed to be. There's no gumming or debris in the carburetor, and the metering diaphragm couldn't be any better. I'm not even worried about the primer bulb either, as there are no cracks or tears in it. I really don't have any other things that I can check. I hate to say it, but I'm just going to put the carburetor back together and reinstall it onto the engine. If it doesn't start, then I'll consider swapping the carburetor for another one I have on hand. Once I've got the fuel filter line back onto the carburetor, I'm going to prime the fuel system. This will let us know if we either have to put the other carburetor on or that we fixed it. Well, would you look at that, it's working now. There must have been an air leak in the carburetor at one of the gaskets, probably on the primer bulb side. With the carburetor working now, let's put the return line back on and then reinstall the carburetor back onto the engine. Well, that was some pretty bad luck just then. It looks like we're going to have to replace the return line as well. This won't be hard, but we will need to change the fuel line to one that's slightly bigger. The process is the same as before, just with a 3/16 or 190 thousandths inch fuel line. You'll want to cut it at an angle and push it into the tank like you did before. You won't have to cut the angle piece off, as it won't matter since this line is just a return line for the fuel. It's good practice to prime the fuel system one more time just to make sure everything is still working like it's supposed to. Now it's finally time to reconnect the throttle cable to the carburetor and reinstall it back onto the engine. I didn't forget about the air filter. I'll just replace it later on once I get it running. The carburetor adjustment screws are on the front of the carb, and hopefully we won't have to use them. Well, fortunately, we did get it running again, but we found out it needed a slight carburetor adjustment. I had to turn the L screw out twice, a quarter turn each, to keep it from bogging down when squeezing the throttle. We will need a further adjustment later on, though, once it's cooled down. Also, the on-off switch doesn't seem to work, which is kind of a pain. I really do hate choking an engine to get it to stop. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate your time. Please feel free to ask any questions, and I hope to see you in my next video.